My husband gave my sister foot massages and took her to couples weekends while calling me paranoid. He exploded when I did the same with his brother. My husband Ryan and I had been married for 4 years when my younger sister Haley moved back to town. She'd just finished college and needed a place to stay while job hunting. We had a spare room, so I invited her to stay with us. Ryan was supportive and said family should help each other out. He even helped her move in and set up her room. I thought I was lucky to have such a caring husband. The first few weeks were fine. Haley would cook dinner to contribute, we'd all watch movies together, and she was actively applying for jobs. Ryan would give her career advice since he worked in marketing and she wanted to get into advertising. They'd spend hours reviewing her portfolio together. I was happy they got along since my previous boyfriend hadn't liked my family. Then I started noticing things. Ryan would touch Haley's shoulder when he walked past her. His hand would linger on her back when moving around her in the kitchen. When we'd watch movies, he'd sit between us when he used to always sit next to me. If Haley wore her hair up, he'd touch her neck while complimenting the style. I mentioned it to him and he said I was imagining things. He was just being friendly with his sister-in-law. He said I was being paranoid because my ex cheated on me. Haley said the same thing when I brought it up. She said I was being insecure and Ryan was just naturally affectionate. She actually said I should be happy my husband and sister got along so well. The touches got worse. He'd play with her hair while she showed him something on her phone. He'd massage her shoulders after she said work was stressful. He'd rest his hand on her knee during dinner conversations. He started buying her little gifts like her favorite candy or books she mentioned wanting. When I told him to stop, he'd laugh and say I was being controlling. Haley would roll her eyes and say married people didn't own each other's bodies. She'd say I was lucky Ryan even put up with my jealousy. Family dinners became unbearable. Ryan would compliment everything Haley wore. He'd tell her she looked beautiful when she'd come down in pajamas. He'd refill her wine glass constantly while forgetting mine. He'd laugh at all her stories, even the boring ones about her commute. When I'd try to join the conversation, they'd act like I was interrupting. They had inside jokes from their coffee runs that I didn't understand. Ryan started working from home on days Haley was off. They'd spend all day together while I was at the office. When I'd come home, they'd be cooking together or sitting close on the couch looking at something on his laptop. They'd immediately separate and act busy with other things. Ryan would suddenly need to make work calls. Haley would remember she had to do laundry. One night I came home early from book club with a headache. Ryan's car was in the driveway, but the house was quiet. I found them in the living room. Haley was lying on the couch in tiny shorts and Ryan was rubbing her feet. Her legs were across his lap. They jumped apart when they saw me. Ryan said Haley had been on her feet all day at her new retail job. Haley said it was just a foot rub and I needed to relax. She actually accused me of sexualizing normal family affection. I told Haley she needed to find her own place. She said I was being a jealous wife who couldn't handle her husband having female friends. Ryan agreed and said I was pushing family away over nothing. They made me feel crazy for being uncomfortable with my husband giving my sister foot massages. Ryan slept on the couch that night saying he couldn't share a bed with someone who didn't trust him. Haley came down later to check on him. I heard them talking until 3 a.m. That's when I started planning. First, I invited Ryan's brother Colin to stay for a few weeks. He was between apartments and I said we had room. Ryan couldn't say no without looking like a hypocrite after his speech about helping family. Colin was attractive and single. He worked as a personal trainer. I made sure to be just as touchy with Colin as Ryan was with Haley. I'd touch his arm when laughing at his jokes. I'd fix his collar before we went out. I'd sit next to him during movies with my leg pressed against his. I'd compliment his muscles and ask about his workout routine. I'd make him special protein shakes every morning. Ryan noticed immediately and got angry. I said I was just being friendly with my brother-in-law. The exact words he'd used. I told him he was being insecure and paranoid. Haley got weird about it too. She started competing for Colin's attention, wearing lower-cut shirts and shorter skirts. She'd bend over in front of him unnecessarily. She'd ask him to help her reach things she could easily get herself. She started working out in the living room when Colin was around. Colin noticed and asked me what was happening. I told him everything. He was disgusted with both Ryan and Haley. He said Ryan had always been selfish, but this was a new low. We came up with a plan. The next family dinner, Colin announced he was taking me out for lunch the next day to thank me for letting him stay. Just the two of us at a nice restaurant downtown. Ryan lost it and said that was inappropriate. I looked Ryan right in the eye and said Colin and I were just having lunch as family. We'd been doing the same thing he and Haley had been doing for months now. His face went from pale to red in about 2 seconds. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He tried to say it was completely different but couldn't seem to find the words for why. Haley crossed her arms from where she sat on the couch and shot me a look that could cut glass. Her jaw was tight and her eyes were narrow. Colin jumped in before Ryan could find his voice again. He said he thought it was really nice that his sister-in-law wanted to spend quality time with him. He said we should get to know each other better since we were family now. His voice was calm and steady like he was talking about the weather. Ryan's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle working in his cheek. He said through his teeth that I was doing this just to make a point. I didn't deny it. I just smiled and said we'd leave around noon tomorrow. Ryan stormed off to the bedroom and slammed the door. Haley got up and followed him, but he told her through the door that he needed space. She stood there for a minute looking lost before going back to her own room. Colin gave me a small nod and went to take a shower. The next morning I got up early and put on the blue dress Ryan used to say was his favorite. I made Colin a huge breakfast with eggs and bacon and fresh fruit. I asked him about his workout routine loud enough that my voice carried down the hall. Colin played along and told me about his training schedule and his clients. Ryan came out of the bedroom looking like he'd been hit by a truck. His eyes were red and puffy. His hair stuck up in weird directions. He stared at me in my dress and then at the breakfast spread. His expression turned dark and angry. He poured himself coffee without saying a word to either of us. I complimented Colin on how dedicated he was to staying in shape. Colin thanked me and said I should come to the gym with him sometime. Ryan's hand shook as he lifted his coffee mug. He left for work 20 minutes early without eating anything. Colin and I went to Martello's for lunch. It was the same upscale Italian place where Ryan had taken Haley for her birthday last month. He'd told me he was working late that night. I found out about the dinner from Haley's Instagram stories the next day. The restaurant had white tablecloths and candles on every table. Colin and I got a table by the window. We ordered pasta and wine and actually had a nice time talking about his life and his goals. He told me about his gym and his plans to expand. I told him about my job and the projects I was working on. We laughed at a story he told about a client who kept trying to lift weights that were way too heavy. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of us both smiling. I posted it right away knowing Ryan checked my social media about 10 times a day. My phone buzzed with a text from Ryan within 5 minutes asking where I was. I didn't answer. When we got home 3 hours later, Ryan was pacing in the living room. He must have left work early. He whipped around when we walked in and demanded to know what we'd talked about for 3 hours. His voice was sharp and accusing. I smiled at him real sweet and said we just got to know each other better. Those were the exact words he'd used about his time with Haley. His face went red again and his hands balled into fists at his sides. Colin excused himself and went upstairs to give us space. Ryan started asking me specific questions about what we discussed and what Colin said about him. I told him it was just family bonding time and he shouldn't worry so much. He looked like he wanted to throw something. Haley's door opened and she came out wearing the tightest workout clothes I'd ever seen. Her sports bra showed off everything and her leggings were practically painted on. She walked right up to Colin as he came back downstairs and asked if he wanted to go to the gym with her. She touched his arm and tilted her head in that way she did when she wanted attention. Colin looked at her and then at me. He said no thanks. He was planning to help me reorganize the garage this afternoon. Haley's face fell and her hand dropped from his arm. She looked between me and Colin like she couldn't believe what was happening. I felt a rush of satisfaction watching her realize she wasn't the center of attention anymore. She mumbled something about going alone and left without looking at any of us. That evening, we all ended up in the living room for a movie. I sat down right next to Colin on the couch and let my leg press against his. It was exactly what Ryan had been doing with Haley for months during our movie nights. Ryan stood in the doorway staring at us for a long moment. His jaw was tight and his hands were in his pockets. He sat down in the armchair instead of on the couch like he normally would. About halfway through the movie, I shifted closer to Colin to reach the popcorn. Ryan stood up so fast he knocked over the side table. He stormed down the hall and slammed our bedroom door so hard that the picture frame on the wall fell and crashed to the floor. Glass scattered across the hardwood. None of us moved to clean it up. Colin looked at me and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine and we kept watching the movie. After the movie ended, I went to the bedroom. Ryan was sitting on the bed typing on his phone, so fast his thumbs were a blur. I asked him who he was texting. He didn't look up and said it was none of my business. The irony hit me hard. He'd been monitoring my phone for months, saying he was just being caring and making sure I was safe. He'd ask to see my messages and would get upset if I hesitated. Now suddenly his phone was private. I told him I was going to bed and he could sleep wherever he wanted. He kept typing and didn't respond. The next day I called Alana during my lunch break at work. I asked if I could come over after work to talk. She said of course and that she'd make dinner. When I got to her house, she took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. She didn't ask any questions until we were sitting at her kitchen table with tea in front of us. Then I told her everything. I started with how Ryan touched Haley and moved on to the foot massage and the couple's retreat. I told her about inviting Colin and mirroring Ryan's behavior back at him. I told her about lunch at Marcello's and Ryan's reaction. She listened without interrupting and her expression got darker as I talked. When I finished, Alana was quiet for a minute. Then she said she was so angry on my behalf she could barely see straight. She said she knew something was off when she met Ryan and Haley at the summer barbecue back in July. She'd noticed how Ryan's attention was always on Haley and not on me. She'd seen how uncomfortable it made me even though I kept making excuses for him. She said she'd wanted to say something but didn't want to overstep. She wished now that she had. I heard footsteps behind us and turned to see Hassan walking into the kitchen. He'd been in his home office on a call but must have finished early. He looked between Alana and me and immediately seemed to sense the tension in the room. Alana filled him in quickly on what we'd been discussing, her voice getting harder as she recounted Ryan's behavior with Haley. Hassan's expression darkened with each detail. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table with us, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He looked me straight in the eye and said he would never touch his sister-in-law the way Ryan had been touching Haley. He said that kind of constant physical contact crossed clear boundaries that any married man should respect. Hassan explained that being friendly with family didn't require touching someone's hair or giving them foot massages while they wore tiny shorts. He said my gut instinct had been right all along and that Ryan had been gaslighting me into doubting my own perceptions. Hearing a man validate what I'd been feeling for months made something break loose in my chest. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone outside the situation to confirm I wasn't crazy or paranoid. Hassan said Ryan's behavior was disrespectful to me and to our marriage, and that mirroring it back to him through Colin was actually brilliant, because it forced Ryan to confront his own double standards. Alana squeezed my hand and suggested we document everything that had been happening. She grabbed a notebook and pen from the counter and we started making a detailed timeline. We went back to when Haley first moved in, and I first noticed Ryan touching her shoulder. I remembered the date because it was 2 days after she arrived. We added every incident I could recall with specific dates and details. The hair touching during portfolio reviews in early June, the shoulder massages that started in July, his hand on her knee during dinners throughout August, the inside jokes from their coffee runs, him working from home on her days off, the foot massage incident 3 weeks ago that had been my breaking point. Seeing it all written out in black ink made the pattern undeniable. It wasn't random friendly touches or my imagination. It was months of escalating inappropriate behavior that Ryan had dismissed and minimized at every turn. Alana added notes about things she'd witnessed at the summer barbecue, like how Ryan had barely left Haley's side and kept refilling her drink while ignoring mine. Hassan mentioned he'd noticed Ryan's hand on Haley's lower back when they'd all been at our house for dinner last month. The timeline filled 3 full pages. Looking at it validated everything I'd been feeling and gave me concrete evidence that I wasn't making this up or overreacting. We made copies and Alana said I should keep one somewhere safe in case I needed it later. I folded the pages and put them in my purse, then thanked them both for believing me and helping me see the situation clearly. When I got home an hour later, the house smelled like garlic and herbs. I found Haley in the kitchen wearing a low-cut black top that showed off her cleavage and a short denim skirt that barely covered anything. She was stirring something on the stove and humming to herself. I could see her bending over more than necessary to check things in the oven, clearly performing even though I was the only one home. Colin was in the living room sitting in the armchair with a thick book open in his lap. He barely looked up when Haley called out to ask if he wanted to try her new pasta sauce recipe. He said he was good and went back to reading. She tried again a few minutes later, asking if he could help her reach something on the top shelf. He said she should use the step stool in the pantry and turned a page without looking at her. I watched her face fall and felt a small surge of satisfaction. She'd been competing for Colin's attention all week and he was making it clear he wasn't interested. I went upstairs to change out of my work clothes and heard Ryan's car pull into the driveway. I stayed in the bedroom for a moment, listening. The front door opened and closed. Ryan's voice carried up the stairs asking what smelled so good. I heard him walk straight to the kitchen without calling out for me or Colin first. I came down quietly and stood in the doorway watching them. Ryan was leaning against the counter next to Haley, telling her she looked beautiful and asking about her day at work. His hand rested on the small of her back like it belonged there. He laughed at something she said about a difficult customer and moved closer to look at what she was cooking. I cleared my throat loudly and they both jumped slightly. Ryan finally looked at me and said, "Hey," like he'd just noticed I was home. Haley turned back to the stove without saying anything. I asked Ryan how his day was, and he gave me a short answer about meetings and deadlines, then immediately turned his attention back to Haley and her pasta sauce. The contrast was so obvious it almost made me laugh. Colin came into the kitchen and suggested we all eat together since Haley had made enough food for everyone. We set the table in uncomfortable silence. During dinner, I waited until everyone had food on their plates before mentioning that Colin and I were planning a weekend trip to the mountains to go hiking. I said it casually, like it was no big deal, just the two of us getting some fresh air and exercise. Ryan's fork clattered against his plate and bounced onto the table. He stared at me with his mouth slightly open, then said absolutely not. He said it was completely inappropriate for a married woman to go away with another man for a whole weekend. His face was red and his hands were clenched into fists on either side of his plate. Colin set down his water glass and asked calmly how it was different from Ryan taking Haley to that couple's wellness retreat last month. The one I wasn't invited to despite being Ryan's actual wife. Ryan's face went pale and all the color drained from his cheeks. He stammered that the retreat was about stress management and that Haley had needed support after a really hard week at her retail job. Colin raised his eyebrows and looked at me, then back at Ryan. Haley was staring down at her plate like she wanted to disappear into it. I pulled out my phone and opened the retreat's website that I'd bookmarked weeks ago. I turned the screen so everyone at the table could see it. The homepage clearly marketed itself as a romantic getaway for couples with photos of people in robes holding hands and watching sunsets together. I scrolled down to show the activities list, which included partner massage workshops, couples yoga sessions, and sunset wine tastings on a private beach. Haley suddenly became very interested in cutting her pasta into smaller and smaller pieces. Ryan fumbled for words, opening and closing his mouth like a fish. He tried to claim he didn't know it was a couples retreat and thought it was just a general wellness seminar for stressed professionals. I asked him why he never mentioned any of the activities when he got back from the weekend. I asked why there were photos on Haley's Instagram of them doing partner yoga together on a mat with their hands intertwined. Ryan said the yoga was just one small part of the weekend, and that I was taking everything out of context. Haley finally spoke up, her voice defensive and shaky. She said I was twisting everything to make them look bad when they were just being close family members who supported each other. I looked directly at her and asked if she honestly thought it was normal for her sister's husband to give her foot massages while she was wearing tiny shorts with her legs spread across his lap. The room went completely silent. Even the sound of silverware stopped. Colin looked disgusted and said he didn't know about that specific detail. Ryan tried to downplay it, saying it was just a foot rub and that Haley's feet had hurt from standing all day at work. Colin stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He said he needed some air and walked out the back door into the yard, clearly uncomfortable with his brother's behavior and unwilling to sit there and listen to more excuses. After Colin left through the back door, Ryan spun toward me with his face twisted in anger. He jabbed his finger in my direction and said I'd poisoned his brother against him. I stayed calm and told him I'd simply told Colin the truth about what had been happening in our house for months. I reminded him that he was the one who called me paranoid when I first brought up his behavior with Haley. Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out because he knew I was right. His hands clenched into fists at his sides and his jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't say out loud. Haley had been sitting frozen on the couch during the whole exchange, but now she suddenly burst into tears. She jumped up and ran down the hallway to her room with her hands covering her face. The door slammed so hard that a picture frame rattled on the wall. Ryan immediately forgot about me and went after her without a second glance. I heard him knock on her door and call her name softly. The door opened and closed, and then I could hear their muffled voices through the wall. I walked closer to the hallway and pressed my ear against the wall near her room. Ryan's voice came through telling her that I was being unreasonable and jealous. He said I was making something out of nothing and that she hadn't done anything wrong. I pulled away from the wall feeling sick, but also weirdly satisfied. This was exactly what I needed to see. Ryan comforting Haley instead of talking to his wife proved everything I'd been saying about their weird relationship. I went to the kitchen and started cleaning up the dinner dishes just to keep my hands busy. The water ran hot over the plates while I scrubbed harder than necessary. About an hour passed before I heard the back door open again. Colin came in looking tired and apologetic. He found me in the kitchen and said he was sorry for leaving like that. He explained that he needed some air to process everything he'd learned. I told him I understood and asked if he wanted some coffee. We sat at the kitchen table and he told me quietly that he'd always known Ryan was selfish. He said Ryan had always put himself first, even when they were kids. But Colin said this situation with Haley was worse than he'd realized. He looked genuinely upset and said he couldn't believe his brother would disrespect me like this in my own house. I felt tears starting but blinked them back. Colin reached across the table and squeezed my hand just once before pulling back. That night I went to bed alone while Ryan stayed on the couch again. This was becoming a pattern. I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle. Around 2 a.m, I heard soft footsteps on the stairs. I got up quietly and cracked our bedroom door open just enough to see into the living room. Haley was walking down in her pajamas with her hair messy from sleep. She sat down on the couch next to Ryan, who was still awake. He immediately put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. They started talking in hushed voices that I couldn't quite make out. But I could see how she leaned into him and how his hand rubbed her arm. My stomach turned and I felt like I might throw up. I closed the door as quietly as I could and got back into bed. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I got dressed and went downstairs with my decision made. Haley was in the kitchen making coffee in an oversized t-shirt that barely covered her shorts. I told her she had 2 weeks to find a new place to live. She spun around with her mouth hanging open. She said I couldn't be serious and that I was kicking out my own sister over nothing. I stood firm and said her time here was up. She needed to find her own apartment. Haley's eyes filled with tears and she said I was being cruel and unfair. Ryan came into the kitchen then and demanded to know what was going on. When I repeated that Haley had 2 weeks to move out, he got angry. He said I couldn't make that decision without talking to him first. I looked him straight in the eye and reminded him that the house was in my name from before we got married. I'd bought it with money from my grandmother's estate 3 years before I even met him. Ryan's face went pale and his mouth opened and closed like a fish. He clearly had forgotten this detail. He tried to argue that we were married, so it was his house too, but I cut him off. I told him the deed had only my name on it, and that was that. I left them both standing in the kitchen and went to get my phone. I called Alana and asked for the name of that family therapist she'd mentioned before. She gave me the contact information for someone named Elena Roach. I made an appointment for myself alone that afternoon. I needed a professional to tell me if I was handling this right, or if I really was being as unreasonable as Ryan kept saying. The rest of the morning passed in tense silence. Ryan and Haley stayed in the living room whispering to each other while I got ready for my appointment. When I left the house, neither of them said goodbye. Elena's office was in a small building downtown with plants in the waiting room. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm way of speaking. I sat down on her couch and everything just poured out. I told her about Haley moving in and Ryan's touching and the foot massage and the couple's retreat. I showed her the timeline that Alana had helped me create with dates and specific incidents written down. Elena listened without interrupting and took notes on a pad. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. She said that Ryan's behavior was emotional infidelity at minimum. She explained that even if nothing physical had happened between Ryan and Haley, the emotional intimacy and physical touching crossed clear boundaries. She said his response of calling me paranoid and jealous was textbook gaslighting. Elena told me that my strategy of mirroring Ryan's behavior back to him with Colin was understandable. She said it made sense that I wanted him to feel what I'd been feeling. But she warned that this approach might make the situation blow up in ways I couldn't predict. She asked me what outcome I actually wanted from all this. Did I want to save my marriage or did I want to end it? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I sat there staring at her while the question hung in the air between us. I realized I didn't know the answer anymore. After 4 years of marriage, I wasn't sure I even wanted to stay with Ryan. The thought was scary and sad and also somehow freeing all at once. Elena must have seen something in my face because she leaned forward and said that not knowing was okay. She told me this was a normal response to betrayal and gaslighting. She said I didn't need to decide right away and that it was important to give myself time to think clearly without pressure. I left Elena's office feeling validated, but also scared. The therapist said I wasn't crazy and that my feelings were reasonable, but she also warned me things might get worse before they got better. I drove home slowly, trying to prepare myself for whatever Ryan might say or do next. When I pulled into the driveway, his car was already there even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. He usually worked until at least 6. I grabbed my purse and walked up to the front door with my stomach in knots. Ryan was standing in the living room holding a huge bouquet of roses and lilies. His eyes were red like he'd been crying, and his hair stuck up in different directions like he'd been running his hands through it. The flowers looked expensive, probably from that fancy shop downtown that charges $50 for a basic arrangement. He held them out toward me without saying anything at first. I just stood there in the doorway staring at him and the flowers. He cleared his throat and said he'd been thinking all day about what I said at breakfast. He said he realized I had some valid concerns about his behavior with Haley. He wanted to go to couples counseling to work through everything. His voice cracked when he said he couldn't lose me over this. I took the flowers because it felt awkward not to, but I didn't smile or thank him. The whole thing felt too convenient, like he'd practiced this speech in the mirror. I asked him why he suddenly cared about my concerns when he'd been calling me paranoid for months. Ryan said seeing me so upset this morning made him realize how serious this was. He promised he'd been thinking about it all day at work and couldn't focus on anything else. He kept saying he loved me and wanted to fix things. I told him one counseling session wouldn't fix months of him touching my sister and making me feel crazy. He nodded quickly and said he understood, but he wanted to at least try. He looked so desperate standing there that part of me felt bad for him. But I remembered what Elena said about not making decisions based on pressure or guilt. I told Ryan I'd go to one session to see what a professional thought about the situation. He looked relieved and tried to hug me, but I stepped back. I wasn't ready to be touched by him yet. I put the flowers in a vase while Ryan watched me from the kitchen doorway. He kept trying to make small talk about my day, but I gave short answers. Haley stayed in her room all evening and didn't come out even for dinner. Ryan made pasta and tried to act normal, but the tension was thick. We ate in silence except for the sound of forks scraping plates. 2 days later, we sat in the counselor's waiting room not looking at each other. Ryan had found someone who could see us quickly, a woman named Dr. Harris who specialized in marriage problems. The office smelled like lavender and had those inspirational posters about communication on the walls. When Dr. Harris called us back, Ryan jumped up first and held the door open for me. The counseling room had 2 couches facing each other with a chair in between where Dr. Harris sat. She was probably in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a bun and kind eyes behind glasses. She asked us to sit wherever we felt comfortable. Ryan sat on one couch and patted the cushion next to him, but I chose the other couch across from him. Dr. Harris noticed but didn't comment. She introduced herself and explained how the session would work, then asked who wanted to start. Ryan immediately launched into his prepared speech about how I'd been inappropriately close with his brother. He said I'd been touching Colin constantly and making him uncomfortable. He listed examples like fixing Colin's collar, sitting close during movies, and planning a lunch date. Dr. Harris listened without interrupting, taking notes on her pad. When Ryan finished, she asked him to be more specific about what made these actions inappropriate. Ryan said it was obvious that a married woman shouldn't be that physical with another man. Dr. Harris nodded and asked if there were any other behaviors that concerned him. Ryan mentioned the protein shakes I made Colin every morning and how I complimented his muscles. He said it felt like I was flirting with his brother right in front of him. Dr. Harris turned to me and asked for my perspective. I took a deep breath and explained that everything Ryan just described was exactly what he'd been doing with my sister Haley for months. I told her about the shoulder touches, the hair playing, the knee touching during dinner, and especially the foot massage. Ryan's face went red, but he didn't interrupt. Dr. Harris looked between us and gently pointed out that Ryan seemed to have different standards for his own behavior versus mine. Ryan got defensive immediately. He said it was completely different with Haley because she's my sister, so there couldn't be any attraction involved. He insisted his touching was just friendly family affection, while mine with Colin was clearly flirting. Dr. Harris asked him why he assumed there was no attraction between him and Haley, but assumed there was between me and Colin. Ryan stammered that it was just obvious. I looked directly at Ryan and asked him if he was attracted to Haley. The question hung in the air for what felt like forever. Ryan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His eyes darted between me and Dr. Harris. He shifted in his seat and pulled at his collar. Finally, he said of course he thought Haley was pretty, but that didn't mean anything. The hesitation before his answer told me everything I needed to know. My stomach twisted, but I wasn't surprised. Dr. Harris asked Ryan to continue. He said that yes, he found Haley attractive, but he never acted on it. He insisted all his touching was just friendly affection between family members. Dr. Harris wrote something on her pad, then asked Ryan if I had consented to him being physically affectionate with another woman in our home. Ryan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked at me, then back at Dr. Harris. He finally said he didn't think he needed my permission to be nice to his sister-in-law. Dr. Harris explained that in a marriage, both partners should feel comfortable with the level of physical contact their spouse has with others. She asked Ryan if he'd ever asked me how I felt about his touching of Haley. Ryan admitted he hadn't because he thought I was just being paranoid. I felt tears building up behind my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of Ryan. I told him his behavior had destroyed my trust and made me feel invisible in my own marriage. I said coming home every day to watch him fawn over my sister at dinner made me feel worthless. Ryan's eyes filled with tears, and he said he never meant to hurt me. He admitted he liked the attention Haley gave him because I'd been distant lately. His voice broke when he said he just wanted to feel appreciated. I felt anger flash through me at his excuse. Dr. Harris asked Ryan what he meant by distant. He said I'd been working late almost every night and seemed stressed and distracted all the time. He said I barely talked to him anymore and we hadn't been intimate in weeks. I pointed out that I started working late to avoid coming home to watch him touch my sister and laugh at all her stories while ignoring me. I told him I withdrew because being around him and Haley together made me feel sick to my stomach. Dr. Harris asked if Ryan understood the connection between his behavior and my withdrawal. Ryan looked genuinely shocked, like this thought had never occurred to him before. His face went pale and he stared at me across the space between our couches. He said he thought I was just stressed about work and didn't realize it was because of him and Haley. Dr. Harris explained that when one partner feels hurt or neglected, they often withdraw as a form of self-protection. She said Ryan's behavior likely caused my distance, not the other way around. Ryan put his head in his hands and his shoulders shook. Dr. Harris gave us both homework assignments to complete separately before our next session. We each had to write out what we wanted from the marriage and what we were willing to change. She scheduled us for another appointment in 1 week and said we should avoid making any big decisions until then. The drive home was painful. Ryan tried to hold my hand when we got in the car, but I pulled away and grabbed my seatbelt instead. He looked hurt but didn't say anything. We drove in complete silence except for the sound of traffic and the radio playing quietly. I stared out the window watching houses and stores pass by while my mind raced. Could this marriage actually be saved? Did I even want to save it? Ryan had admitted he was attracted to my sister and had enjoyed her attention. How was I supposed to get past that? Every few minutes I could feel Ryan glancing at me, but I didn't look back. When we pulled into our driveway, I noticed Haley's car was there, but the house looked dark inside. We walked in through the front door and I immediately saw boxes stacked in the hallway. Haley came out of her room carrying another box and wouldn't look at either of us. She announced she was moving in with a friend from work tomorrow. Her voice was flat and angry. She walked past us to add the box to the pile without making eye contact. Ryan asked if she needed help moving, but she said her friend was coming with a truck in the morning. I felt relieved she was leaving, but also sad that our relationship had come to this. Haley went back to her room and shut the door hard enough to make the pictures on the wall shake. That evening after dinner, Colin found me in the kitchen doing dishes. He said quietly that he was heading back to his new apartment this weekend. His lease had started and his furniture was delivered on Saturday. He thanked me for letting him stay and said he hoped things worked out between Ryan and me. But he also said he'd support whatever decision I made about the marriage. He gave me his new address and phone number in case I needed anything. I hugged him and thanked him for helping me see the truth about Ryan and Haley. Colin said Ryan was his brother, but that didn't excuse his behavior. He told me I deserved better than someone who made me feel crazy for having reasonable boundaries. After Colin went upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the homework assignment from Dr. Harris. The blank paper seemed to mock me. What did I want from this marriage? The question felt impossible to answer, because I wasn't even sure I wanted to stay married anymore. I picked up the paper from the counselor and stared at the first question. What do you want from this marriage? The words blurred as I sat there at the kitchen table with my pen hovering over the blank space. An hour passed while I tried to write something, anything, but my mind kept circling back to the same thought. I wasn't sure I wanted this marriage anymore. The realization sat heavy in my chest as I finally set the pen down and pushed the paper away. Ryan came into the kitchen carrying his own homework sheet, already filled out in his neat handwriting. He sat down across from me and slid it over so I could read his answers. Set better boundaries with family members. Stop comparing my wife to other people. Make her feel like my priority in all situations. The promises looked good written out like that, each one addressing exactly what I'd complained about for months. But reading them just made me feel tired instead of hopeful. He'd written what the counselor wanted to hear, what I wanted to hear, but I couldn't make myself believe he would actually follow through. Ryan asked if I wanted to share mine, and I told him I wasn't finished yet. He nodded and said we could work on them together if I wanted help. The offer made my skin crawl because it felt like another way for him to control the narrative and make sure I wrote the right things. I told him I needed to finish it alone, and he looked hurt but didn't push. He went upstairs to give me space, and I heard the bedroom door close softly. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of boxes being dragged across the floor above me. Haley was packing up the rest of her things to move out. I stayed in bed listening to her footsteps going back and forth between her room and the stairs. Ryan got up and went to help her carry boxes down to her car. I heard their voices in the hallway but couldn't make out the words. When I finally came downstairs an hour later, most of her stuff was already loaded up. Haley walked right past me to grab the last box from the living room without saying a single word. Her face was set in angry lines and she wouldn't even glance in my direction. Ryan stood by the front door holding it open for her while she made trip after trip to her car. I watched from the kitchen doorway as she came back inside one final time to do a sweep of her room. She emerged with her arms full of random items she'd forgotten, and Ryan took some of them from her to help. They walked outside together and I followed, standing on the porch while they loaded everything into her trunk. Haley turned to Ryan and hugged him tight, her arms wrapped around his neck. The hug lasted way too long and I saw him lean down to whisper something in her ear. She pulled back and nodded with tears running down her face. Then she got in her car and drove away without ever looking at me once. The house felt strange after she left. Ryan came back inside and we stood in the hallway surrounded by the empty spaces where her boxes had been stacked. The quiet was different from before, less tense but also kind of sad. Ryan tried to act like everything was normal, asking if I wanted coffee and commenting on the weather. But he kept glancing at me sideways like he was waiting for me to explode or pack my own bags. I went about my day doing laundry and cleaning the kitchen while he worked on his laptop in the living room. Every time I walked past him, I could feel his eyes following me around the room. At dinner, he tried to make conversation about his day at work, but I only gave short answers. We ate in uncomfortable silence, and then he did the dishes while I went upstairs to take a shower. When I came back down, he was sitting on the couch staring at his phone, and the whole house felt like we were both just waiting for something to happen. I called Elena the next morning and asked if I could come in for a solo session. She had an opening that afternoon, so I drove over right after lunch. Her office was in a quiet building with comfortable chairs and plants everywhere that made it feel calm. I sat down and immediately started talking about the couples session and everything Ryan had promised to change. Elena listened without interrupting, her face neutral and thoughtful. When I finished, she asked me what my gut was telling me about the situation. I took a long breath and admitted that I didn't trust him anymore. The words felt both scary and freeing to say out loud. I told her I wasn't sure trust could be rebuilt after months of gaslighting and watching him be inappropriate with my sister. Elena nodded slowly and said that was a very honest answer. She asked if I'd been able to complete my homework from the counselor, and I shook my head. She didn't seem surprised. Elena pulled out a notebook and said she wanted to do an exercise with me. She drew a line down the middle of the page and wrote divorced on one side and married on the other. Then she started asking me questions about what each option would look like in real terms. What would my daily life be if I divorced Ryan? Where would I live? How would I spend my time? Who would I see? I described living alone in the house that was already in my name, having quiet evenings without tension, maybe getting a cat. The picture felt scary because I'd be alone, but also kind of freeing because I wouldn't have to walk on eggshells anymore. Then she asked about staying married and what that would look like. I described trying to rebuild trust while always wondering if Ryan was being honest, watching his interactions with other women, going to endless therapy sessions, hoping he'd actually change. That picture felt safe because it was familiar, but also heavy and hard to breathe in. Elena let me sit with both options for a few minutes before asking which one made me feel more like myself. I didn't have an answer ready, but the question stuck in my head. When I got home that evening, I found Ryan in the kitchen making dinner. He'd cooked my favorite pasta dish and set the table with candles like he was trying to recreate our early dating days. I told him I needed to talk, and he immediately stopped stirring the sauce to give me his full attention. I said I needed space to think clearly about everything, and that I was going to stay at Alana's house for a week. Ryan's face went pale and he started shaking his head before I even finished talking. He said I couldn't leave, that we needed to work on this together, that running away wouldn't solve anything. I stayed calm and told him this wasn't running away. It was getting the distance I needed to figure out what I actually wanted. He moved closer and grabbed my hands, begging me not to go. He promised he would do anything to fix this, go to therapy every day, cut off all contact with Haley, whatever I needed. But I pulled my hands back and said I was firm about needing this space. His face crumpled and he asked how long I'd be gone. I repeated that it would be a week and then I'd come back to talk. He followed me upstairs while I packed a bag, asking questions and making promises the whole time. I kept packing without responding to most of it. When I carried my bag downstairs, he stood by the door looking lost and desperate. I walked past him to my car and drove to Alana's house without looking back. Alana opened the door before I even knocked and pulled me inside with a hug. Hassan appeared from the kitchen and took my bag, carrying it upstairs to their guest room without asking any questions. Alana made tea and we sat on her couch while I explained what happened with Ryan. She said I could stay as long as I needed and that they were happy to have me. That night I slept in their guest room with the window cracked open and the sound of crickets outside. I slept better than I had in months, waking up actually rested instead of exhausted. Hassan made breakfast in the morning with eggs and toast and fresh fruit, setting a plate in front of me without any fuss. Alana sat with me at their kitchen table while I ate, not pushing me to talk or make decisions, just being there. Their house felt peaceful in a way mine hadn't in forever. On the third day at Alana's, my phone started buzzing constantly with texts from Ryan. "When are you coming home? Are you okay? Can we talk? I need to know you're safe." Then the messages got more pointed. "Are you with Colin? Is that what this is about? Did you leave me for him?" I read them and felt anger rising in my chest at his accusations. His jealousy and suspicion felt like more manipulation, like he was trying to make this about my behavior instead of his. I didn't respond to the Colin questions because I refused to defend myself against made-up scenarios. Alana saw me staring at my phone and asked if everything was okay. I showed her the messages and she rolled her eyes, saying Ryan was showing his true colors by immediately jumping to accusations. Hassan agreed and said controlling partners always tried to flip the script when they lost control. I put my phone on silent and tried to stop checking it every 5 minutes. That evening at dinner, Alana's son Kareem came home from basketball practice and joined us at the table. He was 17 with his dad's height and his mom's eyes, polite and easygoing. Halfway through the meal, he looked at me and asked why I was staying with them. Alana started to tell him it wasn't his business, but I said it was fine. I gave him a simple version about having marriage problems and needing space to think. Kareem nodded seriously, and then said something that made me laugh. He said his generation didn't put up with disrespect like that if someone treated you badly, you just left. Alana smiled and said it wasn't always that simple when you were married, but Kareem shrugged and said it seemed pretty simple to him, that you either respected each other or you didn't. His straightforward view of the situation made something click in my head. Maybe it really was that simple, and I'd been making it complicated by trying to save something that was already broken. I spent the rest of that evening lying in Alana's guest room, staring at the ceiling while my mind worked through everything. The truth sat heavy in my chest like something I'd been carrying for months without realizing the weight. I'd been making excuses for Ryan's behavior because the alternative scared me more than staying did. Being alone meant starting over at 32 after investing 4 years in a marriage I thought would last forever. It meant admitting I'd been wrong about him and facing my family's questions, and dealing with the embarrassment of another failed relationship after my ex cheated. But somewhere between Kareem's straightforward teenage logic and the peace I felt in this quiet guest room, something shifted. Staying with someone who made me question my own reality was worse than any fear of being alone. Ryan had spent months touching my sister inappropriately while calling me paranoid and jealous. He'd gaslit me until I doubted my own perceptions. He'd chosen Haley's feelings over mine every single time. No amount of fear about the future could make that acceptable anymore. On day 5 at Alana's house, I woke up to the sound of aggressive knocking downstairs. My phone showed 9:47 a.m. and I had 6 missed calls from Ryan. The knocking got louder and I heard Hassan's voice saying something firm but calm through the door. I pulled on sweatpants and crept to the top of the stairs where I could see the front entrance. Hassan stood in the doorway blocking Ryan from entering while Ryan's face got redder by the second. Ryan was saying he needed to talk to me right now and that this was ridiculous. Hassan kept his voice level and told Ryan that I would reach out when I was ready, and that showing up was uninvited wasn't respecting my boundaries. Ryan tried to look past Hassan into the house and called my name. His voice had that edge to it that used to make me apologize just to calm him down. Hassan didn't budge from the doorway and repeated that Ryan needed to leave. Ryan started arguing that Hassan had no right to keep him from his own wife. His voice got louder as he said I was being dramatic, and that we needed to talk like adults instead of me hiding at my friend's house. Hassan stayed calm but firm and said that adults respect boundaries when someone asks for space. Ryan's face went from red to almost purple, and he started jabbing his finger toward Hassan's chest without quite touching him. Alana appeared beside Hassan in the doorway, and her voice cut through Ryan's ranting. She told him he had 10 seconds to get off her property before she called the police. Ryan turned his anger on her and said she was poisoning me against him, and that this whole situation was her fault for encouraging me to leave. Alana pulled out her phone and started dialing. Ryan finally backed up off the porch, but he wasn't done talking. He shouted that I was abandoning our marriage and running away instead of working on our problems. He yelled that this was all my fault for not trusting him and making everything about my insecurities. His voice carried down the quiet suburban street, and I saw a neighbor peeking through their curtains. Alana said the police were on their way, and Ryan finally got in his car. He peeled out of the driveway fast enough to leave rubber marks on the street. I came downstairs shaking and found Hassan locking the front door while Alana canceled the police call. Hassan looked at me and asked if I was okay. I nodded, but my hands were trembling and I sat down hard on their couch. Alana sat beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. We didn't say anything for a few minutes while I processed what just happened. Ryan's outburst confirmed what I already knew deep down, but hadn't wanted to admit. He wasn't actually sorry or willing to change. He was just upset that his comfortable situation where he got attention from two women had been disrupted. His anger wasn't about missing me or wanting to fix our marriage. It was about losing control and having consequences for his actions. Everything he'd shouted on Alana's front lawn was about blaming me instead of taking responsibility for his own behavior. The Ryan I married would never have shown up at someone's house demanding entry and yelling in their driveway. Or maybe he would have and I just hadn't seen it before because I'd never challenged him like this. I picked up my phone and searched for divorce attorneys in our area. My hands were still shaking, but I felt clear-headed in a way I hadn't in months. Alana saw what I was doing and squeezed my shoulder but didn't try to talk me out of it. I found a lawyer with good reviews and called to schedule a consultation. The receptionist had an opening the next morning at 10, and I took it without hesitating. When I hung up, Hassan brought me a cup of coffee and sat in the chair across from me. He said Ryan's behavior at the door was controlling and aggressive, and that I was making the right choice by protecting myself. Alana agreed and said she was proud of me for taking steps forward instead of going back to a situation that made me miserable. The next morning, I met with the divorce attorney in her office downtown. Her name was Jennifer Smith, and she had 20 years of experience with family law. I sat across from her desk and explained the whole situation while she took notes. When I finished, she looked up and asked a few clarifying questions about our assets and how long we'd been married. I told her the house was in my name from before the marriage and that we had no kids. She nodded and said that would make things more straightforward than they could have been. She explained the divorce process step by step and what paperwork I would need to gather. She said since we'd been married less than 5 years and had no children and the house was solely mine, we could potentially do an uncontested divorce if Ryan cooperated. The whole thing could be finalized in a few months if everything went smoothly. She asked if I thought Ryan would fight the divorce, and I remembered his desperate face at Alana's door. I said I didn't know, but that he seemed more interested in controlling the situation than actually saving the marriage. Jennifer said she'd seen that pattern before, and that we should prepare for him to either contest everything out of spite or give up completely once he realized I was serious. She gave me a folder of documents to fill out and said she'd start drafting the initial paperwork. I wrote her a check for the retainer and left her office feeling both terrified and relieved. I stayed at Alana's for the full week I'd originally planned. On the last day, I packed my small bag and thanked them for everything. Alana hugged me tight and told me their door was always open if I needed anything. Hassan said I was welcome back anytime and that he was glad I was taking care of myself. I drove back to my house mid-afternoon and Ryan's car was in the driveway. My stomach clenched, but I reminded myself that this was my house and I had every right to be here. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was a disaster. Dirty dishes covered the kitchen counter and the sink was full of crusty plates and glasses. Empty takeout containers littered the coffee table in the living room. The trash can was overflowing and the whole place smelled stale like old food and unwashed laundry. Ryan was sitting on the couch in sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt staring at his phone. He looked up when I walked in and I barely recognized him. His face was pale and unshaven with dark circles under his eyes. His hair stuck up in weird angles like he'd been running his hands through it. He clearly hadn't been eating well based on how his shirt hung loose on his frame. He stood up fast when he saw me and started talking immediately. He said he was so glad I was home and that he'd been worried sick about me. His voice had this desperate quality I'd never heard before. Part of me felt bad seeing him like this, but mostly I just felt resolved about what I needed to do. This wasn't my responsibility to fix anymore. I set my bag down and told Ryan we needed to talk. He nodded eagerly and started saying he'd been thinking about everything and that he wanted to go to therapy and work on our marriage. I held up my hand to stop him and said I wanted a divorce. The words came out clear and steady even though my heart was pounding. Ryan's face went through several expressions in quick succession. First shock with his mouth falling open and his eyes going wide, then anger with his jaw clenching and his hands balling into fists. Then finally desperate pleading as he stepped toward me. He said we could fix this and that he would change and that he was sorry for everything. He promised to go to therapy and to never speak to Haley again, and to do whatever I wanted if I would just give him another chance. His voice broke on the last words and tears started running down his face. I stood there watching him fall apart and felt nothing except a weird sense of distance. I'd heard these promises before in the counselor's office, and they hadn't meant anything then either. I was done making decisions based on what Ryan promised he might do someday. I told him I'd already hired a lawyer and that the divorce papers would be ready soon. His face crumpled and he sank back down onto the couch. He asked where he was supposed to go, and I said that wasn't my problem to solve anymore. He had 3 days to pack his things and find somewhere else to stay. Ryan moved out 2 days later. He packed boxes slowly like he was waiting for me to change my mind, but I stayed firm. His parents came to help him load everything into a moving truck, and his mom gave me a cold look like this was all my fault. I didn't bother explaining anything to her. Ryan took one last look around the house before leaving, and I thought he might try to talk me out of it again, but he just walked out the door. I watched the truck pull away, and then stood alone in my house for the first time in months. The silence felt strange after all the tension and drama. I walked through each room seeing what Ryan had left behind, and what was finally just mine again. In our bedroom, I found the framed photo of us from our wedding day still on his nightstand. I picked it up and looked at our smiling faces. We'd looked so happy and hopeful. I put the photo face down in a drawer and started planning how to make this space feel like mine instead of ours. I wanted to repaint the walls and rearrange the furniture and erase the traces of a marriage that had slowly poisoned itself. My phone buzzed constantly over the next few days with calls from Haley. I let every single one go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to talk to her yet, and maybe I never would be. She finally sent a long text that I almost deleted without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. The message said she was sorry and that she didn't realize how inappropriate things had gotten with Ryan. She said she got caught up in the attention and competition and didn't think about how it was affecting me. She claimed she never meant to hurt me and hoped we could talk eventually. Twice, and then put my phone down without responding. Her apology felt hollow and self-serving, like she was more worried about looking bad than actually understanding what she'd done. She'd enabled Ryan's behavior for months and made me feel crazy for being uncomfortable. She'd competed for his attention and worn revealing clothes around my husband in my own house. Sorry wasn't enough to fix that kind of betrayal. Jennifer called the next week to say the divorce paperwork was ready for Ryan to sign. She'd had her office send everything to the address he'd given, which was his parents' house. She said Ryan's response would determine how quickly things moved forward. I waited nervously for 3 days before she called back. Ryan had signed everything without contesting a single point. Jennifer sounded almost surprised and said usually there was more back and forth even in straightforward cases. She said Ryan's lawyer had called to confirm he wasn't fighting anything and just wanted it done. Apparently he looked defeated when he signed the papers and didn't ask any questions or try to negotiate. Jennifer said we could move forward with filing everything with the court, and that barring any complications, the divorce should be final within a few months. I thanked her and hung up feeling lighter than I had in over a year. 3 months dragged by in a blur of paperwork and lawyers' phone calls, and waiting for signatures on documents that would officially end my marriage. Jennifer called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work and told me everything was finalized. The judge had signed off that morning and the divorce was official. I thanked her and hung up and sat at my desk staring at my computer screen for 10 minutes before the reality sank in. I was divorced. Single again at 32. That weekend, Alana threw me what she called a divorce party at her house with just a handful of close friends. She hung up a banner that said, "New Beginnings," and made margaritas and ordered pizza. Hassan grilled burgers in the backyard and kept refilling my drink while Alana's friends from her book club told me stories about their own divorces and fresh starts. One woman had left her husband after 20 years and now ran a successful bakery. Another had discovered her love of travel after her divorce and had visited 12 countries in 2 years. They made it sound like an adventure instead of a failure. I felt lighter that night than I had in over a year, like I could finally breathe without the weight of Ryan's judgment and Haley's presence crushing my chest. I started reclaiming pieces of myself I'd lost during the marriage. I dug out my old painting supplies from the garage and set up an easel in the spare room where Haley used to sleep. I painted abstract landscapes in colors that made me happy instead of worrying if Ryan would think they matched the living room furniture. I joined a hiking group that met every Saturday morning and climbed trails I'd wanted to explore for years, but never had time for because Ryan preferred staying home. I went back to my old book club that I'd quit when family dinners with Ryan and Haley became too uncomfortable to skip. The women welcomed me back without questions, and we discussed novels over wine, while I remembered what it felt like to have opinions that weren't dismissed or mocked. I took a pottery class at the community center and made lopsided bowls that I actually kept instead of hiding them because someone might laugh. Each hobby felt like finding a piece of myself I'd buried to make room for Ryan's needs and preferences. Colin texted me 4 months after the divorce asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. I said yes, and we met at a cafe downtown on a Sunday afternoon. He looked good, tanned and relaxed, and he hugged me before we sat down. He apologized for Ryan's behavior and said he'd tried talking to his brother multiple times, but Ryan didn't seem to get it. Colin told me Ryan was in therapy now, going twice a week to some counselor their mom had found. But he still talked about the divorce like something that happened to him instead of something he caused. Ryan apparently told his therapist that I'd overreacted to normal family affection and pushed him away when he was just trying to be close to my sister. Colin shook his head while telling me this and said it didn't surprise him that Ryan still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. Ryan had always been good at making himself the victim in every situation. We talked for 2 hours about other things like Colin's new apartment and his personal training business and my painting and hiking. It felt good to have him as just a friend without all the drama and manipulation that had surrounded us before. 6 months after the divorce became final, I woke up in my house on a Saturday morning and realized I was genuinely happy. The sun came through my bedroom window that I'd repainted a soft blue instead of the beige Ryan had insisted on. I made coffee in my kitchen without worrying about anyone else's preferences or schedules. I walked through rooms that felt peaceful instead of tense with unspoken resentment and inappropriate attention. I'd learned to trust my instincts again after months of being told I was paranoid and jealous. I'd learned to set boundaries that I wouldn't compromise no matter who pushed against them. I'd learned that being alone was infinitely better than being with someone who made me question my own reality and feel crazy for having reasonable expectations. Haley and I had started family therapy 2 months earlier, meeting every other week with a counselor who specialized in sibling relationships. The sessions were hard and sometimes I left feeling angry or sad, but we were slowly rebuilding something. Things would never be the same between us, and I'd accepted that. She'd betrayed my trust in ways that couldn't be completely erased, but I was hopeful we could find a new normal where we were sisters again, just with much clearer boundaries than before. I'd started dating casually, meeting guys through friends or apps and going on first dates without pressure or expectations. I took my time getting to know them and walked away at the first red flag instead of making excuses. I knew now what I deserved and what I wouldn't tolerate, and I wasn't settling for anything less than genuine respect and honesty.